Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of building a threading jig for a wood lathe. And in part 1 we got to this stage here where I got the post built and the mechanism for sliding in and out for your thread depth. Now if you haven't seen that video, I'll leave a link in the description. In this video I want to build the parts that go on the front here. So that includes the round piece that gets welded onto the top dovetail and the spindle that goes inside. I've drawn up a bit of a plan, so let's go take a quick look at that. There are primarily 4 parts to this build. So the first is this outer cylinder, and all it is pretty much just a hollow piece of round section. I don't have anything big enough, so I'll have to make that out of solid steel and just bore the center out. Now that gets welded onto the top dovetail along this face here. There's also the spindle down the bottom here. That has a 1 1/4 by 8 TPI thread, so that will match the thread in the chuck here. And it also has a 16 TPI thread along the length of it here. And that's the thread that will get transferred onto the wooden part that you are putting a thread on. There is also an intermediary part here, and this is what I call the threading sleeve. So the threading sleeve has a thread in the middle, so that's 16 TPI, which matches this thread. So the spindle actually screws into this, and then this slides into this outer cylinder at the top here. And it's done that way for a couple of reasons. One is there is a little tension screw here which adds tension to the thread, so it'll have some sort of soft material here, plastic or Teflon, I'm not too sure yet, but we'll get to that when we start working on it. So that takes up the play in the thread or the backlash. And then that part just slides into here, and there's a locking screw at the top here to lock it all in place. So the spindle and the threading sleeve sort of come as one piece, and this is where you can actually make another pair of these with a different thread if you want to have a coarser or finer thread. And then the last part is the handle over here, which just fits on to the end of the spindle, and that allows the user to turn the work as they're doing the threading. In regards to materials, I have a piece of 40mm steel bar here, and that will do for the spindle. And then I have some 50mm solid bar, which will do for the threading sleeve and the outer cylinder. Now I sort of had a bit of a think about this, and I think the order of operations is to first turn up the outer cylinder, and that can be welded onto the top dovetail, and then work on the spindle, because I need to make sure that the thread for the chuck and the 16 TPI thread are all kept as true as possible so that the chuck doesn't sort of wobble around the end here. And then I'll work on the threading sleeve, and then I'll make that thread to suit the 16 TPI thread on the spindle. This is 50mm round bar, and I've made this extra long so that I can make both the outer cylinder and the threaded sleeve with it. I'm making the outer cylinder first, and I clean up the face and the surface there. Then I need to drill and bore out the center to around about 36mm. And then that is parted off in the lathe. Over on the milling machine, I'm milling a flat on here so that I can line it up square with the dovetail. I've lined everything up and clamped it all down onto the flat surface of the table, and then I can weld it together. I'm just using small welds here. I didn't want to get the part too hot and risk distorting the cylinder. Now the bottom dovetail is too long because the cylinder's welded there, so I'm just marking off where I need to cut that piece off. And that's cut off with a skinny wheel. That part is all complete apart from a screw that will go on the top to lock in the threaded sleeve. The next job is to make the spindle. This is 40mm solid bar and it's quite rusty, so I have to do a few passes here to clean it up properly. Then I start working on the end where the chuck will be screwed on. I've made this extra long and I turn this part down a bit further. This is just in case I need to put it back in the lathe the other way round, so I've got a machined surface to do that with. Running a scratch pass, as you can see it's the second scratch pass. Don't ask me what happened there, but we've got 8 TPI, which is exactly what we need. Put some cutting oil on there and we just do the threading dance. Basically thread across, come out, come back, go back in and thread again. Now check the chuck on there and this fit is absolutely perfect. There's hardly any slop in there at all, and I bring the tailstock up for some support and then fire it up and I can't even see any sort of wobble there at all. I haven't put a gauge on it, but I don't think there's any need to. So moving on, I need to hack out the centre here. It's taken quite a lot of material off and I needed to change tools to clean up the part on the right. Also needed to take down the end to about 20mm. That's because there's a handle that will go on there, but it will also act as a runoff for the threading tool to go into as well. We're doing a scratch pass again. This is 16 TPI. Again, I'm pleased that everything lines up there. And then again the threading dance, back and forth, until you have the thread finished. Now that's pretty much done. All I have to do is just chop it off at the end there, and then we can work on the threaded sleeve. I cut that off in the vise with the grinding wheel, turned it round and put it back in the lathe to true up the end. There's a lot of stick out here, so I'm taking very fine cuts. And I almost forgot that I needed a centre in here. This is important because this is how we set the centre height for the jig when it's on the lathe. Now I start on the threaded sleeve. This is a piece of 50mm bar and I clean up the outside. Then I turn this part down so that it fits in the outer cylinder that's welded to the dovetail. I got a very bad finish, so I gave it a bit of a dressing up with some sandpaper. The next step is to drill out the centre. I decided to cut this off now because I didn't want to thread into a blind hole. I've turned it around and now I'm boring out the centre to the correct size for threading. I was setting up for threading and I noticed that the compound slide handle hits the lamp stand here and the tool was not in the middle of the work, so I had to disconnect it and take it off so I could get that travel in there. After verifying the scratch pass, I start threading, and I don't show all of this on video. You've probably seen enough threading on these videos so far. That is the final product, and that screws in there nicely. I do a test fit on the lathe, and this works beautifully. I'm almost ready to make the handle that goes on the end here, but before I do that, there's a couple of little things I need to do first to finish these parts off. So the first is I need a locking screw in here, and that will go through here, and then there'll be a flat milled onto this part. So once that goes in, we can lock down this sleeve so that it's locked in place within this round piece. Also, on this piece here, we need some tensioners. Now, the threading jigs I've seen on YouTube, they only have one tensioner, and it's usually a grub screw, and it has some sort of soft material in there to push on the thread without damaging it. In this particular case, I want to put them like a third apart. So we have one there, another one there, and a third one around here. And I think that'll work a lot better than just having the one tensioner. Lastly, I want to put a couple of holes in here. So there's one on that side and one on that side, and that's only just to put a piece of steel in here, so when I tighten the chuck onto here, I can hold this piece here. And the chuck doesn't need to be absolutely tight, it just needs to be nipped up. The last thing we want is for the cutting wheel at the end here to pull the chuck and unscrew it off the thread here. So it just needs to be nipped up a little bit. So I start with working on the spindle, and I'm drilling a 7mm hole right through the spindle here. Now there is a lot of stick out, and in hindsight I could have used a larger collet and just clamped up on the threads. And that's exactly what I do when I mill the back of the spindle here for the handle to bolt onto. Now I couldn't use my centre finder to find the centre here, so I'm using the ruler trick to find the centre. Once that's found, I can drill this out and tap it for M10. Next I work on the threaded sleeve, and I've set up my lathe with my shop-made indexing wheel so I can get 3 equal distances around the threaded sleeve. This first mark is for the flat that gets milled into this part, and then I go ahead and mark out the other 3 locations for the tension bolts. Now I didn't have a large enough collet to put this in, so I've just clamped it up in the vise. Then I've used my edge finder on the vise jaws to find the centre, and then I loosen off the cylinder here and I line up the lines that I just made with the centre of the drill. Those are drilled out and I tap those to M10. While it's in the mill, I also mill the flat that will be used to lock the sleeve in place. Here are the parts. I've drilled right through here, and I've also drilled and tapped our 3 tension holes. They're M10, and this is a very fine pitch so that we have some adjustment. Now there is a plastic little sleeve that fits in here before the grub screw goes in. It fits together like that, grub screw locks it all in place, and that part's pretty much done. I now work on the handle. This is 40mm round bar, and I clean up the face and the surface there. Next I drill it and bore it out to the correct dimension for a nice neat fit on the spindle. And then that is parted off at 14mm wide. I drill a hole right through here, so this has 2 purposes. One is for a grub screw and the other is for the handle arm to fit into. The bottom hole needs to be for the grub screw, so I just tap all the way through from the top all the way down to the bottom. And then I come back later and just drill the top out and also ream it to 9mm. I also need to mill a flat on here because the handle arm will sit flush on this part. This is 12mm square bar, and this is what I make the handle arm out of. I'll dial it in the 4-jaw chuck, and I turn down the end to 9mm to suit the hole we just made. I put some Loctite around the part, and then that's pressed into the handle. Now I need to drill and tap a M6 hole in this arm, and that's for where the handle will bolt onto. I made this aluminium handle off camera, and this bolt has a shoulder on it, so once I tighten it up, the handle can still rotate freely, and the entire handle is held in place with that grub screw there. Pretty much all the machining's done, so now I wash down all the parts in acetone so they can be cold blued. There is one part that's painted, and that's the top dovetail here. Can you guess what colour? Green, my favourite. I'm using birchwood permablue to blue all of those other parts. And in hindsight, I should have probably really had a bigger container to do this in. Once they're been washed off and thoroughly dried, I cover them in a coat of oil for protection. Well, I've got the threading jig practically done. There's just a couple of things I need to do. One is in here, I need to make up some plastic type material or dowel to go in here, and then these grub screws will go in here, and that will put a little bit of preload on the thread just to stop any movement there. I mean, there's hardly any movement there now anyway, but the other purpose is that it will put a bit of friction on the thread and stop the cutter from, if it digs in and tries to unscrew the chuck or something like that. So there's 3 of these holes around this part here, and they will put equal pressure on the thread to keep it all aligned in the center. Now, I don't have any plastic material, and I have a friend that I'm meeting tonight, so he's going to give it to me, and I'll turn that down and fit it into these holes and put the grub screws in. And then that's pretty much done. I mean, it can be used. The other thing is there is another ring you can put here. So basically what happens is when you wind this in to the cutter and it's cutting, and then it gets to the recess inside the piece of wood here, I want to put a ring here that you can put up and put a locking screw in, and that just provides you a stop so that you don't run into the bottom of the piece of wood. So I mean, it's not necessary to have it, but it's just something good to put on here as well. So I haven't made that yet, so I'll do that off camera. So I also need to make up a drawbar for the cutter that goes into the spindle. So what I'm going to do here is end the build video, and then I'll make another video on actually using the threading jig and show you how it all works when you're threading something like a wooden box. There's quite a lot of information in there, so that really warrants its own video. So I'll get that made over the next few days, and then you'll be able to see how it all works. I hope everyone has a great day, and as always, thanks for watching.